Detroit's morning wasn't just cold. It was cruel. The frost on the windowpane of the third-floor apartment blurred the world outside, but 7-year-old Nia didn't need to see clearly to know the monster was there. He always was. She pressed her forehead against the freezing glass, her breath hitching as she spotted him. The man in the beige coat. Richard Sterling. He stood on the corner of Via Marquez like a statue, immune to the biting wind, his eyes fixed on the entrance to her building. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't waiting for a bus. He was checking his watch, counting down the seconds until she had to walk out that door. Nia turned back to the dim, heatless living room, desperation clawing at her throat. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice trembling. Grandma Bessie lay slumped in the recliner, wrapped in 3 threadbare blankets, her chest rising and falling with a terrifying, raspy rattle. The empty insulin vials on the table mocked them. Yesterday, Nia had tried. She had held Officer Miller's hand at the precinct, tears streaming down her face, begging him to make the man stop following her. The officer had just chuckled, calling it an active imagination. Even Principal Higgins had looked right through her, too busy to listen to a troubled kid from the projects. The system hadn't just failed her, it had abandoned her. She was 7 years old, and she was completely alone. Nia tightened the straps of her pink backpack, her fingers numb. She couldn't stay. If she didn't go to school, she wouldn't get the free lunch, and if she didn't eat lunch, she couldn't sneak half of it home for Bessie. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she unlocked the heavy door and stepped out into the gray morning. The wind hit her like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the terror that seized her when Sterling straightened up. He saw her. A smile curled on his lips, predatory, patient, and terrifying. He took a step off the curb, moving to cut her off. Panic exploded in Nia's chest. She looked left. Empty. She looked right. And then she saw it. A massive black Lincoln Navigator was rolling down the street, silent and ominous as a hearse. The windows were tinted pitch black, hiding the interior, but every kid in the neighborhood knew who owned that car. Elijah the Judge Vance. The man who owned the streets. The man who made grown gangsters cross themselves when he passed. He was a different kind of monster, a shark swimming through their crumbling neighborhood. But as Sterling quickened his pace, his hand reaching into his pocket, Nia made a choice that defied all logic. She didn't run away from the shark. She ran toward it. Nia bolted into the street, throwing her tiny body directly into the path of the massive black vehicle. Tires screeched against the asphalt, the smell of burnt rubber filling the air as the 2-ton beast skidded to a halt inches from her scuffed sneakers. The driver's door flew open, a bodyguard shouting, but Nia didn't flinch. She walked straight to the rear window and tapped on the glass. The window rolled down slowly. A face appeared from the shadows, scarred, hard as granite, with eyes that could freeze water. Elijah Vance looked down at the child who dared to stop him, his expression lethal. But Nia didn't back down. She gripped the strap of her backpack, looked past his terrifying mask, and whispered the 6 words that would change everything. "Can you walk me to school?" For a heartbeat, the world on Via Marquez simply stopped. The wind died down, the stray dogs ceased their barking, and even the distant hum of the city faded into a terrified silence. Elijah's bodyguards had already moved, their hands hovering over the bulges in their jackets, ready to eliminate a threat. But this wasn't an assassin or a rival gang member. It was a 7-year-old girl with uneven pigtails and a trembling lip, asking the devil for a favor. Elijah stared at her, his dark eyes narrowing. He was used to people begging for mercy, for more time on alone, or for forgiveness for mistakes they wouldn't survive. But safety? No one asked him for that. He was the danger they needed protection from. Yet, looking into Nia's wide brown eyes, he saw a terror so raw it pierced through his cynicism. It was the look of a child who had realized the monsters under her bed were real, and no one was coming to turn on the lights. "Why aren't you safe, little one?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Nia didn't speak. She just raised a shaking finger and pointed across the street. Elijah's gaze followed the line of her finger, landing on Richard Sterling. The man in the beige coat was still there, watching, his fake smile faltering into something uglier as he realized who Nia was talking to. Elijah's pulse ticked once, sharp and cold. He knew that face. Sterling had come to him months ago, trying to buy protection for his import-export business. Elijah had thrown him out the moment he realized the cargo wasn't drugs or guns, but flesh and blood. Sterling was a trafficker, a predator, and he was hunting on Elijah's street. A cold fury, older and deeper than any anger Elijah had felt in years, settled in his chest. He had many sins on his soul, but harming children wasn't one of them. It was the one line in the sand he drew with blood. Without a word to his stunned security team, Elijah Vance opened the car door fully and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. He towered over the girl, a giant in a cashmere coat, but then he did the unthinkable. He knelt on one knee, bringing himself down to her level, ignoring the expensive fabric pressing into the dirty sidewalk. "He won't touch you," Elijah said, his voice soft but absolute. "Not today. Not ever." He held out a hand. It was a hand that had pulled triggers and signed death warrants, scarred and calloused. Nia looked at it, then at his face. She didn't see the crime lord. She saw a promise. She reached out and wrapped her tiny fingers around his massive palm. Elijah stood up, lifting her gaze along with him. He didn't look at his men. He looked directly across the street at Sterling. The look lasted only 3 seconds, but in the underworld, it was a declaration of war. It said, "She is mine now." Sterling, pale and sweating, took a stumbled step back, the predator suddenly realizing he had become the prey. "Let's go to school," Elijah said. And so they walked. The most feared man in Detroit and a little girl with a pink backpack, hand in hand down the center of Via Marquez. Curtains twitched in windows. Shopkeepers came to their doors, mouths agape, watching the impossible. The ghost of Detroit was playing crossing guard. But for Nia, the fear began to melt away, replaced by the warmth of the giant hand engulfing hers. When they finally reached the school gates, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Mr. Elijah." Elijah watched her run safely into the building, a strange tightness in his throat. He waited until the doors closed behind her before turning back to his car. The softness vanished from his face, replaced by stone. He pulled out his phone and dialed his second-in-command. "I want everything on Richard Sterling," he commanded, climbing back into the shadows of his Lincoln. "And find out who the girl's grandmother owes money to. The pharmacy, the landlord, everyone. Pay them off. Today." For the first time in months, Grandma Bessie didn't wake up shivering. She woke up to a sound she had almost forgotten: the steady, rhythmic hum of the radiator. The apartment, usually a tomb of damp cold, felt impossibly warm. Confused, she sat up, her joints protesting less than usual, and sniffed the air. It didn't smell like stale medicine and dust anymore. It smelled like roasted chicken, fresh bread, and hope. She shuffled into the kitchen and froze. The table, usually barren, was overflowing. Bags of groceries, boxes of her expensive heart medication, and vials of insulin were stacked like gold bars. Underneath a carton of milk sat a single piece of paper, a receipt from the landlord, stamped paid in full 12 months. Bessie's knees gave out. She sank into a chair, clutching the paper to her chest, and wept. Not tears of pain, but the heavy, shaking sobs of a burden suddenly lifted. When Nia burst through the door after school, cheeks flushed pink, she found her grandmother crying. "Did he do this?" Bessie asked, wiping her eyes. "The man who walked you?" Nia grabbed an apple from the table, biting into it with a crunch that echoed in the quiet room. "Mr. Elijah isn't scary, Grandma," she said simply. "He's just lonely. Like us." News of the miracle on Via Marquez spread through the neighborhood faster than a fire in a dry field. The judge wasn't just taking, he was giving. For a few brief hours, the gray streets of Detroit felt a little brighter. But while the neighborhood celebrated, a storm was brewing 3 blocks away in a dimly lit warehouse by the docks. Richard Sterling was not celebrating. He was raging. The humiliation burned in his throat like acid. He had been stared down in public, shamed by a man he considered a thug. Sterling paced his office, kicking a chair across the room. It wasn't just about the girl anymore. It was about respect. If he let Elijah Vance protect one child and get away with it, Sterling's entire operation, his reputation among the buyers in Europe, would crumble. He needed to send a message. A message loud enough to drown out Elijah's newfound heroism. He stopped pacing and turned to the wall of monitors buzzing with static. He thinks he's a savior now? Sterling hissed, his voice trembling with malice. He thinks because he has money and muscle, he can grow a conscience? His lieutenant, a scarred man named Cale, stood by the door. We can't touch the girl, boss. Vance has eyes on her building. 2 cars. 24/7. I know. Sterling snapped. He walked closer to the screens, his reflection ghostly in the glass. We don't touch her. That's what he expects. He thinks he's won because he saved one. Sterling's finger traced the images on the screens. They weren't of Via Marquez. They were live feeds from 3 other elementary schools in districts where Elijah Vance had no influence. A cruel, jagged smile cut across Sterling's face. Let's see if his heart is big enough to save them all. He turned to Cale, his eyes dead and cold. Trigger the teams. Take 3. Tonight. The news hit Detroit like a physical blow, colder than the November wind. By noon, the whispers on the street had turned into a scream. 3 children were gone, vanished from 3 different schools across the city in the span of 2 hours. No witnesses. No ransom demands. Just empty desks and frantic mothers screaming names into the gray afternoon air. In his penthouse office overlooking the skyline, Elijah Vance stared at the manila envelope that had just been slid under his door. Inside, there were 4 photographs. The first was of Nia, smiling as she walked into school that morning. The next 3 were of children Elijah didn't know: a boy with glasses, a girl in a yellow coat, and a teenager with a basketball. On the back of Nia's photo, written in elegant, jagged script, was a message that made Elijah's blood run cold. You save 1. I take 3. New rules. It's Sterling, Marcus, his second-in-command, said, his voice tight. He's punishing the city for what you did. He wants you to know that your protection has a price. Down at the 4th precinct, the scene was chaotic. Parents were begging for help, but Officer Miller and his captain were drowning in bureaucracy. We can't issue an Amber Alert yet, the captain was saying to a weeping mother. We need evidence of abduction. They might have just run away. The system was doing what it always did, waiting until it was too late. Elijah turned away from the window. He looked at the city. He ruled a kingdom of shadows and concrete. He had spent 30 years building a reputation as a man who didn't care. But looking at the photo of the boy with glasses, he realized he couldn't go back to the dark. He had stepped into the light for Nia, and now he had to stay there. Get the car, Elijah growled, grabbing his heavy wool coat. And tell every dealer, every corner boy, every taxi driver, and every homeless vet on my payroll, the city is closed. No one leaves. Find that van. 20 minutes later, Elijah walked into the living room of Mrs. Johnson, the mother of the missing boy with glasses. The room went silent. Mrs. Johnson, a woman who had once spit on Elijah's car when he drove past her church, looked up with swollen eyes. She didn't see a gangster anymore. She saw a last resort. Why are you here? She choked out. Elijah took off his hat, crushing the brim in his hands. Because the police are filling out forms, and your son doesn't have time for forms. He stepped closer, his presence filling the cramped room. I promise you, on my life, I will bring him back. It was a promise no crime lord should make, a debt he didn't owe. But as he walked back out into the freezing dusk, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a homeless man stationed near the shipyards. Just a blurry photo of a gray van and a location. Pier 42. Warehouse C. Pier 42 smelled of rust, dead fish, and impending tragedy. Inside the cavernous, dimly lit Warehouse C, Richard Sterling stood admiring his work. A rusted shipping container sat in the center of the concrete floor, its heavy doors padlocked. Inside, muffled sobs echoed against the metal walls. Sterling checked his watch. The cargo ship, the Vulture, was docking in 20 minutes. Once those children were on board, they would be gone forever, ghosts in the system, and Elijah Vance's reputation would be shattered. He's not coming, Cale laughed nervously, checking his submachine gun. Even the judge knows better than to start a war on the docks. Sterling smirked, lighting a cigarette. He's a businessman, Cale. He did the math. 3 strangers aren't worth his empire. But Sterling had miscalculated. He had forgotten that Elijah wasn't just a businessman. He was a force of nature. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a noise, it was the absence of it. The seagulls outside stopped screaming. The hum of the distant city vanished. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the warehouse floodlights exploded, plunging the vast space into pitch blackness. Flashlights! Sterling screamed, his voice cracking. Watch the doors. Beams of light cut through the dust, dancing frantically. But the threat wasn't coming from the doors. It was already inside. A dull thud echoed from the catwalks. Then another. Cale vanished from Sterling's side with a stifled yelp, dragged into the shadows by unseen hands. One by one, Sterling's men were silenced not by gunfire, but by the ruthless, efficient precision of men who had owned these streets for decades. Panic clawed at Sterling's throat. He backed up against the shipping container, pulling his pistol. "Show yourself, Vance. I'll put a bullet in this metal. I'll kill them." A red dot appeared on Sterling's forehead, then another on his chest, then 10 more, painting him in a constellation of laser sights. From the darkness, a voice emerged, deep, resonant, and terrifyingly calm. "You pull that trigger, and there won't be enough of you left to bury." Elijah Vance stepped into the single beam of moonlight filtering through the skylight. He wore his long black coat like a judge's robe. He held no weapon, his hands deep in his pockets, because he didn't need one. He was the weapon. Sterling's hand shook so violently the gun rattled against the container. I have rights," he stammered, his bravado dissolving into a puddle of fear. "You forfeited your rights when you took children," Elijah said, stopping 5 feet away. He loomed over Sterling, a titan of judgment. "You have 2 choices, Richard. Open that door and waiting for the police sirens I hear approaching, or stay here in the dark with me." The distant wail of sirens grew louder. Elijah had tipped them off. He was handing Sterling over to the law, a final insult to a man who thought he was above it. Sterling dropped the gun. It clattered on the concrete like a surrender bell. He fumbled with the keys, sobbing now, and unlocked the padlock. The heavy doors groaned open. Elijah stepped past the broken man, ignoring him completely, and looked into the darkness of the container. 3 terrified faces looked back. The boy with glasses. The girl in the yellow coat. The teenager. They huddled together, expecting a monster. Instead, the monster crouched down, his shadow stretching long and protective across the floor. "It's over," Elijah said, his voice surprisingly gentle, the same tone he had used with Nia. "Your mothers are waiting." The sun rose over Detroit the next morning, not with its usual gray reluctance, but with a piercing, brilliant gold that seemed to scrub the streets clean. Outside the 4th precinct, there were no yellow tapes, no chalk outlines, and no weeping mothers. Instead, the air was filled with the sound of church bells and the tearful, hysterical laughter of families reunited. The 3 children were safe, wrapped in blankets, clinging to their parents as if they would never let go. Officer Miller stood on the precinct steps, giving a statement to the press about diligent police work and swift justice. But the cameras weren't pointed at him. They were pointed at the black Lincoln Navigator parked at the curb, its engine idling with a low, steady purr. Elijah Vance stood by the open door, buttoning his coat, ready to disappear back into the myths and whispers of the city. He didn't want the credit. He never did. But as he turned to leave, a voice rang out clear and fearless. "Mr. Elijah." Nia broke away from Grandma Bessie's hand and ran down the sidewalk. The crowd of neighbors, parents, and reporters parted like the Red Sea. They went silent, watching the little girl in the pink coat sprint toward the man they had spent years calling a monster. Elijah froze. He turned just in time for Nia to slam into his legs, wrapping her small arms around his knees in a fierce hug. "You found them," she whispered into his coat. "You saved them." Elijah hesitated. For a man who had built an empire on fear, this kind of public affection was terrifying. But then, slowly, he placed a gloved hand on her head. "No, little one," he murmured, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You did. You were the only one brave enough to ask." Mrs. Johnson, the mother of the boy with glasses, stepped forward. She walked past the police captain, past the cameras, and stopped in front of the crime lord. Her eyes were wet, but her head was high. She didn't bow, and she didn't flinch. She simply extended a hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking, "for bringing my baby home." One by one, the neighborhood followed. The baker, the mechanic, the old men who played chess in the park, people who used to cross the street to avoid his shadow, now nodded at him with something that looked dangerously like respect. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the sharpest suits hide the darkest souls, and the scarred hands are the only ones willing to hold you up. Elijah tipped his hat, a rare, faint smile touching his lips. He climbed into his car, the heavy door closing with a solid thud. As the black sedan pulled away, merging into the morning traffic, Nia took her grandmother's hand. "See, Grandma," Nia said, watching the car disappear around the corner. "I told you. He's not a monster. He's just a guardian." In a world quick to judge, a 7-year-old girl reminded an entire city that true heroism doesn't always wear a white hat. Sometimes, it wears a long black coat and carries a heavy past. Elijah's choice teaches us that kindness is not a weakness, but a weapon that can shatter the darkest of chains when wielded with courage. As you walk your own path today, remember to look beyond the surface, for the greatest allies are often found where we least expect them.